For this next section, I just made one of my sample doors that we did from the very beginning. It's a normal door trigger, a normal door. But we're just going to look at a really interesting, not necessarily a scripting thing. It's not really teaching you scripting. It's really kind of teaching you kind of how to make your levels feel a little better. So with my door, the way we set them up at the beginning, if I press play, if I step into the trigger, the door opens. I move away, the door closes. But there's an ability that I can inch up to right at that edge where if I tap forward, it opens. I tap back, it closes. And this sitting on the edge of opening and closing, it can be a really frustrating feeling. So sometimes you're playing the game and you're trying to get to something and you're just in range, and then you get out of range and you're in range and you're out of range. And maybe I got in just enough to open the door and then I step to the side and I'm like, oh, I'm trying to get in there, but it keeps opening and closing on me. And all I did was I moved a tiny little bit. So what we can do to fix that is we can actually set up 2 triggers to operate our door. One trigger is going to be the one where we're close enough to open that door. So if I get within this trigger range, it's going to tell that door to open. The other trigger is a larger trigger that is for my exit when I leave. So rather than just kind of having the standard, this is one that happens when I enter, this is what happens when I leave, which is what we have for this normal door trigger, right? Normal door trigger checks to see if it's the player. As I enter, open the door. As I exit, close the door, right? What I'm going to do is I'm going to actually make a new type of trigger, one for opening, one for closing, and it's going to have 2 different triggers to it. A closer one for opening it, and a further one for closing it when I step outside of it. That way, once my door starts opening, I'm going to have to step further away to close it. I can't just do that wiggle to the side, back and forth. There's a larger gap. And it really does change the way that it feels. So rather than kind of this normal door trigger, I'm going to go ahead and delete that door trigger. We're going to create a new one, right? So I'm going to start by creating my trigger box. Move my trigger box so that it's in the right spot here. Again, these are always better to scale from the center. We'll scale this one out. So I'm going to create that a new blueprint door double trigger. Here's my new door double trigger. I want to make sure that I'm going to open doors, right, with it. So when I go to my event graph, I'm going to create a variable that's going to be my door to open. I'm going to create that. It's going to be of type BP door. Make that visible so that I can get to it. I'm going to go back to my viewport, and here we can see there's the center of my object, and here is my collision component, this collision box, right? So this is going to be the collision box that makes up the element, plus it's got a little sprite that says this is the center. So I'm going to select this, and I'm going to add another trigger to it, right? So here's another box collision inside of it. So now I've got 2 boxes, right? I've got the main collision component, then I've got this smaller box. I'm going to take this box and I'm going to extend it to be larger than the current box is. So I'm coming out a little more, coming out a little higher, come out a little bit more on the sides as well. And so now I have this larger outer box that goes with the inner box. And then when I go back to my event graph, instead of using the actor overlap, right? I'll go ahead and get rid of those. I don't need my tick. I don't need my begin play. Instead of using my actor overlap, we're going to use these collision component and this box. So if I have my component selected, right? Here's my collision component. This is my inner box, right? I'm going to add the on component begin overlap event. So we'll see here that it says this is the on component begin overlap collision component. We don't now need this anymore because I'm not necessarily going to grab this from here, but I just find it myself easier to select these inside of the world here and add the components over on these sections. You can also select them up here. Right click on this, add event, on component begin overlap. I just personally, I don't know why I got in this habit, so maybe I shouldn't pass on my bad habits, but I always find it easier if I just bring that in here, add the event. So I'm going to end when I leave the box, which is the larger one, and then remove that, right? Yeah, so whichever way works best for you. If you want to right click on them up here, you're going to be able to add event. Right click, add event, or you can drag them out, and when they're out in the world, they'll show up over in the details panel. The idea just being which one is going to be easier for you to do. And what we're going to do is that when we overlap the inner component, right? So if I go back to my viewport, I can select them and see, oh, this one's the inner, which is collision component, right? Which if I wanted to, I can rename the box. So this box I could call outer trigger, right? And that way I'll at least know that one is the outer trigger and the other one is the main trigger. I can start with my main trigger, and I can say when you overlap the inner trigger, this is where we're going to check, is it the player class? So is the actor the player class? So is the other actor the player class? If it is, then I'm going to get my door, and I'm going to tell it to open. And then when I leave this trigger, I'm now leaving the outer trigger, the other one, the separate door, or the separate trigger. So this idea that I'm using two triggers. There's my door to open. I'm going to call my closed door event. And that's the object. Oh, I want to check if it's the player class. Sorry, I forgot to do that. Is actor player class? If the actor that is leaving is the player class, we're going to close that door. All right. So now we can see that if I save and compile in our viewport, we have two triggers. One is this box collision. One is this collision component that's kind of built in. And when we enter the inner trigger, it will activate opening the door. But we have to leave the outer trigger before it closes on us. And what this kind of just gives us is now we see it in the world with those two triggers. So I need to select my trigger, and then under my default, set my door to open to my door. And ignore, I don't know why it's opening Visual Studio. All right, so I walk in, as I get close it opens, but I can't do that wiggle thing, right? So even if I get to the outside and it starts closing on me, I can't do that wiggle thing where I'm just at the edge and it starts going on me. This concept of giving me this extra room just gives it a nicer feel. It doesn't seem like I'm accidentally closing the door, like I'm meaningfully moving away from it for it to close, right? So there we go. Very cool. That's just the idea of using two trigger boxes.